This has been Dead America, the second month, the Texas Panhandle, Part 4. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Copyright 2023 by Derek Slayton. Production copyright by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 47. The conversation between Sparks and the citizens of Dalhart had been going on for a good 20 minutes, with Jackie, Ditko, and Mayakolia going into great detail about the threats they were facing from Axton and his Knights of Dumas, but also the stash of weapons and ammo contained within the Connor's gun store.
"Just so we're on the same page," Sparks said slowly. "If we come up and help you deal with your, Knights problem, we can have as much ammunition as we can carry with us back?"
"Correct," the mayor replied. "We don't need an arsenal to defend our sleepy little town. We just need to ensure that the arsenal doesn't fall into the Knights' hands."
She nodded.
"Understood,"
she said, her crimson ponytail bobbing.
"So, how soon can you get here?"
Ditko asked with gruff urgency.
"We don't exactly have a lot of time on our hands."
"I'm going to have to get back to you shortly on that," Sparks replied. "Need some time to figure out the fastest route."
"If it helps, we do have an airport here,"
Colia said earnestly.
"Our tanks are still relatively full, so if you can find you a plane, we can get you filled up."
Sparks nodded again, thoughtfully.
"Good to know," she said. "Stand by."
She sat back in her chair as the line went dead, and looked to her right, where Sergeant Hammond and Private Whitaker sat quietly.
"Well, you heard them,"
Sparks said.
"How do you feel about a road trip?"
The older man cocked his head.
"Whitaker?"
he asked.
She smirked. "You know me, Sarge. I'm never one to turn down free ammo," she drawled.
"All right, let's figure out how we're doing it,"
Hammond said, clapping his hands together. Sparks looked up.
"Wonder if Leon's satellite is coming over anytime soon," she said.
The sergeant shrugged and motioned towards the door.
"Let's go find out,"
he said, getting to his feet. The trio headed out of the house, blinded by the sun as it climbed higher into the sky. They put their hands over their eyes like teenagers who had spent the entire night in the club, only to come out and face God's flashlight. The walk to the main command center was a short one, only a couple of blocks. It was relatively quiet, with the only people up and about at that time of the morning the guards who kept watch for threats, alive or undead.
"Has anybody heard anything from El Paso lately?"
Sparks asked as they strolled. Hammond shook his head.
"Nothing for a week now," he replied. "Last I heard, Rodriguez was still having a hell of a time weeding out all the gang members who weren't exactly thrilled with us taking out Tiago and Angel."
"Even more reason for us to get armed," Sparks said. "If Rodriguez goes down, God only knows what the new leader is going to do to us."
The soldiers nodded in agreement as they reached the command center. Inside, Leon sat at his desk with Detective Rogers beside him. Ethel sat at her desk in the back, but got to her feet at the sight of the door opening, making her way to the coffee maker.
"I'll have another pot brewed up shortly,"
she said brightly. Hammond offered her a 1,000-watt smile.
"Thanks, Ethel," he said.
"You three are up and at 'em early today," Leon said, lacing his hands behind his head.
"Got a situation,"
Sparks said, pulling up a chair. Rogers sighed. "That's always a fun way to start the day," he said.
"Might be a good situation if we play our cards right,"
Sparks said.
"Well, lay it on us,"
the detective invited.
"The nickel version is that there's a town in the Panhandle that has a gang problem," Sparks said. "If we send some help," she inclined her head to Hammond and Whitaker, who both playfully put their hands up, "we can walk away with a small arsenal."
Leon and Rogers shared a look, nodding slowly.
"If there's one thing we could use," Leon said, and fired a playful wink over at Ethel. "Besides another one of you, Ethel, It's an arsenal.
Panhandle's what, 5-6 hour drive from here?
Rogers asked, drumming his fingers on the desk.
Leon nodded. Pretty sure it's mostly empty area, too, he said. We should have enough gas we can scrounge up to get you through there and back, the detective said.
Sparks raised a finger. We might have another option, she said. They have an airport there, and fuel.
Leon nodded thoughtfully. So now we just have to find you a plane to borrow, he said. And a pilot, Rogers added. Landry should be able to handle it, Hammond piped up. Assuming we can find a plane.
Leon nodded and turned to his computer, punching up the satellite. It took several moments to come up, just coming into range. You think you know a place? Sparks asked, leaning in.
I believe I do,
Leon murmured, scanning the area to the northeast of town, sorting through miles upon miles of empty desert. Well, mostly empty desert. As they scanned, black dots moved around the screen.
What the hell are those things moving?
Whitaker asked, squinting as she stared at the screen.
Zombies,
Leon explained.
Those traps we used to lure them off the interstate were more successful than we would have liked.
She shrugged, straightening.
Sounded like a good idea at the time, she said.
A chuckle rippled through the group. They hadn't had any other options back then, but now they were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. Finally, Leon settled in on an area that looked like a green oasis in the middle of the desert. Everybody leaned in, wondering what they were looking at.
There's something you don't see every day, Rogers breathed.
Tell me about it, Leon said.
Found this spot the other day while doing some long-range scans. From best I can tell, it was a farming community built in the middle of nowhere.
Underground aquifer? Sparks asked.
Leon nodded. Most likely, but whatever it was must have attracted some wealthy farmers, he said,
zooming in as far as he could and highlighting the tiny airport on the outskirts of town.
Is that what I think it is?
Hammond asked, voice full of awe.
Leon nodded. Yes, Sergeant, I believe it is, he said.
Everybody studied the screen, scanning what looked to be a couple outlines of small planes.
So, how do we get there?
Hammond asked.
It's about 100-mile drive if you take the highways, Leon said. But seeing as how we have some rugged off-road vehicles, we should be able to cut that time in half.
Sparks nodded sharply.
All right. Looks like we're taking a field trip to the Panhandle, she declared.
Whitaker, go round up Landry, Hammond instructed. Tell him to gear up.
What about Mathis? She asked.
The sergeant paused. Their sniper was still on the mend from his time spent as a guest of the cartel. He finally shook his head.
Tell him to get some rest, he said. This should be a milk run.
Famous last words,
Leon murmured. Hammond chuckled.
Yep, realized my error as soon as the words came out of my mouth.
I'll get my gear too, Sparks said.
The sergeant raised an eyebrow.
You sure?
He asked.
We can handle it.
Those planes usually seat 4, she replied. And besides, when has having more guns on your side ever been a bad thing? He playfully contemplated for a beat before nodding.
Okay, we'll leave in 10, he said.
See if Rufus and Jeff want to ride out with you, Rogers said. Sparks's brow furrowed, and she didn't have to voice her question as she stared at him in confusion.
A town that size must have a grocery store, Rogers explained.
Approached, carrying a tray of steaming mugs.
Please, if you want me to keep pampering you, I'll need to restock sooner or later,
she said with a warm smile. I'll be damned if I'm going to go without coffee. Now that I'm getting it, Sparks said, taking her mug gratefully.
I'll have somebody monitoring the ham radio, Leon said. So when you're on your way back, we can send transportation to pick you up.
Sparks nodded.
Good, she said. If you wouldn't mind, let them know we should be there by sundown.
Be safe, Leon said, and the others headed out of the command center with fresh coffee in hand, heading off to gather their gear and prepare. Chapter 2.
Rufus drove a jacked-up four-wheel drive truck across rough terrain at borderline unsafe speeds. Jeff sat in the back with Hammond, Landry, and Whittaker, with Sparks in the passenger seat. The drive had been mostly uneventful, despite Rufus's creative navigating to avoid the occasional pack of zombies in the desert. Despite pulling thousands of them off of the interstate, the packs had shrunk down to no bigger than a dozen, although there had been quite a few of them. The entire drive there had been a little tense, and Sparks side-glanced his hard-set jaw as he sped up even faster. "Something on your mind?" she finally asked.
"I can't believe you're getting on a plane to go fight a biker gang on the other side of the state," he snapped.
She tried to make light of it, putting a hand to her chest.
"Aw, are you worried about me?"
she asked, batting her eyes.
"Hell no. I know you can kick everybody's ass, them military boys included."
Rufus grunted.
"I'm mad that you aren't taking me with you."
Sparks chuckled, her heart warming a bit at the undertones. He was worried about her, she knew, though he'd never admit it out loud.
"Sorry, small plane, and we don't know exactly what we're going to be dealing with up there," she said.
"Girl, I've weathered shitstorms the size of this great state of ours,"
the older man argued.
"What makes you think I can't handle what you're going to encounter up there?"
She shrugged.
"Rural town. Everything's spread out," she said. "Might have to be riding some horses to get to where we need to get to."
He opened his mouth, paused, and then slowed the truck a little.
"Yeah, my old ass can handle a lot of things, but bouncing my giblets on a saddle for hours on end ain't one of 'em," he finally agreed. "Good looking out for me, girl."
"You say that like I don't look out for you,"
she said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. He shot her a sly grin, and she winked, reaching over and lacing the fingers of her left hand through those on his right. They drove for a few more minutes before he finally slowed to a stop. He flung open the sliding window in the back of the cab.
"All right, looks like we're near town,"
Rufus called through the small hole. The others stood up, stretching and twisting, the rough ride having taken its toll on their bodies.
"When we come back, we're taking the long way,"
Landry groaned.
"My ass is still rattling, and we're not even moving anymore."
Jeff shook his bald head.
"Told you not to let Rufus drive," he said.
"Well, after that impressive string of curse words flew out of his mouth when I suggested I drive, I wasn't about to fight him over it,"
Landry replied.
"Also, something I swear sounded like a bark."
"You ain't as dumb as you look, boy,"
Rufus called, and let out a playful barking noise. Landry flinched a bit, and the older man laughed at his expense. Hammond pulled out a pair of binoculars and scanned the area, letting out a deep sigh. There was a neighborhood to the right that was smaller, maybe 50 houses, and full of dozens of zombies. Farmland stretched all the way to the downtown area, if one could call it that. Zombies were strewn out over the landscape. Hammond easily counted dozens, probably into the hundreds. He let out another sigh.
"You gonna share with the rest of the class, Sarge?"
Whittaker asked dryly.
"Couple hundred of those things. Spread out pretty good, though," the sergeant said.
"Airport?"
Sparks asked through the window. He shook his head. "Can't see it from here," he admitted. "I'm guessing it's further up." Sparks stared down at the printout of the satellite image that Leon gave her. The airport appeared to be to the north of town, no more than half a mile away from downtown.
"Looks like there's a road that goes north out of downtown that will take us to it," she said.
"We can always rough it,"
Rufus declared.
No, Landry said quickly, raising his hands. "Let's talk about this first.
"If you boys are getting supplies, we're going to have to help out with the downtown area," Hammond said.
"Nonsense,"
Rufus replied, holding up a big bag from the floor.
"Everything from redneck rattlers to the butt pucker 3000.
Landry cocked a brow.
"Do I even want to know what the butt pucker 3000 is?" he asked. "Well, if you're within 50 yards of one of them going off, your butt isn't going to unclench until the year 3000.
Rufus bellowed. Landry wrinkled his nose for a beat. Then interest came over his face. "Got any extras of those?" he asked. Rufus laughed. "Don't worry, I packed Sparks a care package," he said. "If I can't blow up bikers myself, the least I can do is make it easier for y'all." "So, you're going to blow everything up?" Hammond asked. "Nah, once we get y'all settled at the airport, Jeff and I can detonate one out here," Rufus said. "Should do a good enough job of pulling them out of town." Jeff cracked his knuckles. "At least long enough for us to do some shopping," he added. "Well, just make sure to pick me up something nice," Hammond said with a grin. The group chuckled as they got situated in the truck bed again. Rufus hit the gas, taking them far around town. The noise from the engine drew a small handful of ghouls, but not many. The airport finally came into view, and it, sadly, was not a pleasant one. There were easily 40 to 50 zombies spread out on the runway, all of which would need to be dealt with before they could safely take off. Rufus stopped the truck so they could plan their attack. "I'm going to go out on a limb and assume you can't just plow through those things on the runway," Jeff asked dryly. Landry shook his head. "Man, a bird can take down a 747 if it hits in the right spot," he said. "So plowing through a couple dozen zombies, even if they are rotting, isn't an option." "Well, a man can dream," Jeff said with a wistful sigh. "We can always use one of the explosives to draw them away," Whitaker suggested. Hammond tilted his head back and forth. "Problem is, if we set it off too early, it will just bring more this way," he said. "So, we're going to have to be in the plane when they set it off. Should give us a big enough window to start it up and get it to the air, and give them enough time to not be here when the crowds converge on them." "What about when we come back, though?" Sparks asked from inside the cab. Hammond cocked a brow. "What about it?" "Well, if we can't take off through a mob of them, I assume we can't land through one either," she said. "Don't worry, girl," Rufus drawled. "When you're on the way home, Jeff and I will clear the runway for you." The bald man shook his head. "Still, shouldn't we take them out now?" he asked. "We could be gone for days," Hammond explained, "so more would just wander up." Yeah, that's a good point," Jeff said. Rufus reached over to the glove box and pulled out a couple of walkie-talkies, handing one to Sparks. "Y'all give me a shout when you're in the plane and ready to go," he said. "Jeff and I will handle the rest." "You heard the man. Let's get moving," Hammond barked, and the 3 soldiers jumped down from the truck. Sparks got out, stepping aside so Jeff could get into her seat. Rufus dismounted and met her in front of the truck. "You come back safe now, girl," he said, voice amused but eyes shining with seriousness. "Don't worry, I'm going to be fine," Sparks promised, pushing up on her tiptoes to give him a kiss. "We'll take good care of her, old-timer," Whitaker said. Rufus scoffed, playfully offended. "Old-timer?" he barked. Whitaker grinned as she held up the bag of explosives. "Thanks for the goodies, Rufus," she said. Sparks patted him on the shoulder and joined the others in readying their weapons. The quartet walked towards the airport, which was a little more than a half a mile away. She glanced back once, and Rufus waved at her before getting back into the truck. The walk was through the desert, over flat and rocky land. There were a handful of zombies about 100 yards away that had taken an interest in them, shambling in their direction. Hammond studied the satellite printout, with the planes circled. "Looks like the planes are on the east side by the hangar," he said. "Before we head there, we need to find the gas pump too," Landry added. "I'm not taking off without a full tank." The sergeant nodded. "Let's secure the plane first," he said. "Silent kills." The others nodded and pulled out knives, getting them ready as they marched towards the airport. One by one, the handful of zombies away from the complex shambled towards them, only to be taken out quickly and efficiently by the soldiers, like they were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Once they were within a quarter-mile, they adjusted their track to the east, not wanting to disturb the throng of zombies on the runway and around the smaller buildings.
Landry stopped, tapping Hammond on the shoulder.
"Let me see the specs, Sarge," Landry said, holding out his hand.
Hammond complied, handing the binoculars over, and the pilot looked straight across the runway. On the far side stood a fenced-in area with what looked like a gas pump. There were also 20 or so zombies around it, like they'd converged on it for a reason.
"Well,"
Landry drew out the word,
"let's just hope that the plane is filled up."
They continued to walk, moving parallel with the back of the hangar building before moving up towards the airport. Hammond gave the signal for silence as they approached, not wanting to give themselves away. Hammond motioned for Whittaker to lead them forward, around the far side of the building. They could hear some light moaning coming from the other side of the wall, but it was a solid building so they couldn't see inside. Whittaker made it to the corner, peeking around and finding a dozen ghouls in the open area between them and the runway. Across were a few more, but not too many. She turned back to the others, giving hand signals to paint a picture of the situation for them. Hammond took point, pairing off himself with Sparks and the other two as a team to clear out the creatures. Everybody nodded, and Whittaker got ready to lead them out into battle. She and Landry went wide to the right, facing off against 8 or so ghouls, while Hammond and Sparks stayed close to the wall of the hangar, facing half a dozen. Landry picked up speed, lowering his shoulder to slam into the lead zombie, getting low enough to catch it in the gut and lift it completely off its feet. He stopped abruptly and shoved, flinging the creature several feet into the air and into a couple more, dominoing them to the ground. Whittaker ran right by him, quickly delivering knife strikes to the fallen creatures' heads, ending them quickly. As she did so, Landry ran around her to take on a creature that was within 5 yards of her, jamming his blade into its head and shoving it backwards to the ground. Whittaker got up and joined him, standing shoulder to shoulder and looking at the remaining handful left.
"You ready to knock him out?"
Landry asked. She nodded. "Lead the way," she agreed, and they exchanged a fist bump before rushing the other zombies, readying themselves for a quick fight. Meanwhile, Hammond and Sparks were delivering a beatdown of their own. Sparks led the way towards the first ghoul, grabbing it by the shirt collar and tossing it backwards to the sergeant, who shoved it against the wall of the hangar and jammed his blade into the back of its head. Sparks moved up to the next one, leaping into the air and delivering a forceful knee to its chest, riding it down to the ground. It reached up in vain as she stabbed it in the head. Hammond came around her, taking on 2 ghouls at the same time. He grabbed the one furthest away from the building and used it as a battering ram, slamming into the other one and pinning them both up against the wall. As he held them there, Sparks leapt up and stabbed both of them with kill shots. He dropped the corpses to the ground, and they turned to the remaining duo, casually walking over and stabbing them straight on, in unison. By the time they were done, Landry and Whittaker rejoined them. They didn't speak. Hammond motioned for them to follow as he took point. They got up to the front of the building, and he looked around the corner at the situation. There were 2 small planes sitting in front of the hangar, which had the doors wide open. A handful of ghouls wandered around the plane, only a couple more inside the hangar itself. They were towards the back of the building, entranced by a constantly moving reflection on the wall, like an undead cat playing with something it didn't quite understand. Hammond dished out instructions silently, using a series of hand motions to direct Sparks to the ones on the runway that were in front of the clearing beside the hangar. Whittaker was to clear the ones inside the building, and Landry was to follow him to the planes. Everybody nodded and broke off to tackle their assigned tasks. Hammond and Landry quickly dispatched theirs, the zombies never seeing them coming. Once the planes were secure, Landry began inspecting them. He opened the door to the first plane, reaching inside and finding the keys on the seat. He put it into the ignition and turned it, letting out a deep sigh. "What's the problem?" the sergeant asked. Landry shook his head. "Battery's gone on it," he said. "Let's hope that's not a trend," Hammond said, and waved for him to follow to the other one. Landry looked around for the keys,
looking out and finding them in the seat. He put them in the ignition, taking a deep breath before clicking it over. He was relieved when the lights on the dash came on. "All right, we're in business," he said. "Good deal," Hammond said. "But why in the hell were the keys left in here?" Landry shrugged. "Looks like they were in here for maintenance, so gotta have the keys handy," he said. The sergeant wrinkled his nose. "Oh, good. These were the maintenance models," he drawled. "Not at all concerning since we're about to pile in and fly to the other side of the state." "Don't worry, Sarge. I'll give it a once-over before we take off," Landry promised. Hammond cocked a brow. "Wasn't aware you were a plane mechanic, soldier," he said dryly. "Oh, I'm not," Landry replied brightly. "I was just saying that to make you feel better." The sergeant sighed, shaking his head, and Landry cracked a smile. "Just see what we need to do to get in the air," Hammond said, sounding tired. Landry hopped up into the pilot's seat and checked all the gauges. He studied everything for several moments before turning back to the sergeant. "Okay, we're looking pretty good," he said. "Fuel?" Hammond asked. Landry tilted his head back and forth. "Probably have enough to get us there," he said, "but I'd rather not chance it." "Okay," Hammond trailed off, glancing back towards the gas pen, which had a couple dozen zombies milling around it. "How much runway do you need in order to take off?" he asked. "I'd prefer all of it, but if that wasn't an option," Landry said, hemming and hawing a bit, trying to figure out what the best answer was. "If you had to start at the gas pump, could you make it?" Hammond prompted. Landry looked at it, then the runway, and nodded. "Yeah, I think so," he said. "Good enough for me," the sergeant said. The others came back over after finishing off their assigned targets. Hammond motioned to Sparks for the walkie, and she handed it over. "Rufus, you copy?" the sergeant asked into the receiver. "Yeah, I got you," Rufus came back. "You all ready to take off?" "Yes and no," Hammond replied. "We need some gas first." Rufus paused for a beat. "Well, call me back after you fill up then," he said. The sergeant took a deep breath. "There's a couple dozen of those things around the gas tank," he explained. "So we're going to need you to go ahead and cause the diversion." "You sure?" Rufus asked, worry in his tone. "Because as soon as you start that plane up, they're going to be coming back in your direction." "That's why we aren't going to start it up until we refuel," Hammond said. Landry stiffened. "Wait, we're not?" he asked. "This thing can't be that heavy," the sergeant said with a shrug. "So, we're going to get a workout in." Whitaker and Sparks exchanged a look that clearly said, "Damn it," and Landry looked concerned for a moment before he remembered that he would be in the cockpit steering. "I promise I'll go easy on the whip," he said with a wink, but quickly withered under the ladies glaring at him, instilling fear into his heart. Okay. I'm just going to remain quiet for the rest of the trip." "First intelligent thing he's said all week," Sparks said, throwing up a hand. Whitaker smirked. "Hey, he was due," she said. Before Landry could offer a retort, a gigantic explosion rattled in the distance. "Hell, I was a lot further away than 50 yards, and it's still going to take a week for my ass to relax," Landry admitted. Sparks grinned wildly. "Rufus is a bit of a mad genius," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "I can see that," Landry murmured. "Okay, let's get this thing ready to move," Hammond declared, and looked into the hangar at a tower line in the corner. He ran over and grabbed it, bringing it back and attaching it to the front of the plane. Sparks and Whitaker came over, warming up their hands to get ready to help pull once the coast was clear. "When they're 20 yards off the runway, we start moving," Hammond instructed. The group patiently waited for the zombies to move out of the way, and finally it was time, and they began to pull. It was a struggle at first to get it moving, but before long, the plane was rolling. They grunted as they went, unable to stop themselves with the strain, and the wheels squeaked a little, which drew the attention of a few zombies who were still close to the runway. "Sparks," Hammond said quietly. "On it," she said, and broke away from the pull line.
casually walking over to the trio of creatures shambling back in her direction. They spread out several yards, and she quickly downed one before ping-ponging through the remaining two and ending the threat. She stood over her victims, looking out at the zombies, still shambling towards the source of the explosion, relieved to see that none of them had turned around. When she made it back to the plane, they were nearly at the gas pen, which was a fenced-in area with a pump inside. Everybody stood outside the fence, looking inside. "What's going on?" Sparks asked quietly. "Just taking in the sights," Landry said, stepping aside so she could see. There was a lone zombie inside, smacking against the fence. Behind it were two corpses on the ground, both with bite marks and head wounds. The zombie wore mechanic's clothes. "At least this dude killed who killed him," Landry said. Whitaker shook her head. "Small consolation, I would imagine," she said. Hammond jammed his knife into the zombie's skull through the fence before working on the lock. "Now we just have to hope the pumps are still working," he said. Sparks pointed to the small solar panel at the top of the pump. "This far out in the middle of nowhere, they didn't want to take any chances," she said. Hammond made it inside, kicking the zombie away while getting the gas pump. He handed it to Landry and he brought it to the plane and attached it. "Just put it on the corporate card," he joked. "We could use the miles." Whitaker smirked. "And where you plan on cashing those in at?" she asked. Landry shrugged. "I don't know yet," he said thoughtfully. "Just like to be prepared." Whitaker rolled her eyes as he continued to pump. After several moments it was topped out, and the pilot handed it back to Hammond. "All aboard!" Landry declared. Everybody clambered inside, settling in. Landry did his checks on the dash, nodding and smiling as everything checked out. "Here we go," he said, and fired up the plane. He hit the gas, the small bird picking up steam as it barreled down the runway. Everybody held their breath a little as the tires removed themselves from the airstrip. It took a few moments to get steady in the air, but once they did, they picked up altitude quickly. Landry moved it to the north before turning to Sparks, pointing towards the GPS. "Punch in the coordinates, then we can sit back and enjoy the view," he instructed. Sparks took out a sheet of paper with the coordinates on them, punching them into the dashboard GPS. After several moments, it was locked in, and they were well on their way to the battle. Landry let out a whoop. "Next stop, the Panhandle." Chapter 3. The flight had been going on for a couple of hours, and everyone was stiff and uncomfortable due to the tight conditions. Sparks had spent the majority of the flight just staring out the window, and Landry watched her for a time. "You daydreaming about anything good?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just letting my mind wander a bit," she said. "It's nice to just have a break from it all, you know?" He tapped his temple. "That's the beauty of being hard-headed," he joked. "Nothing to take a break from." She laughed, shaking her head. "So, what do you know about this town?" he asked, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "What is it called? Dalhart?" "Yep, not much, though," she admitted. "Just a tiny little panhandle town in the middle of nowhere." She hesitated for a moment, frowning as if something had occurred to her. Landry cocked his head. "What is it?" he asked. She chuckled under her breath. "I'll be damned," she murmured. "Hopefully not," Landry quipped. "No, sorry," she said, shaking her head. "Sometime during the first few days of this, I ended up spending the night in an air traffic control tower for a small airport," she explained. "I talked to someone flying out of San Antonio who said they were headed up towards Dalhart because they knew it was out of the way. What was his name?" She trailed off, thinking hard for a few moments before she snapped her fingers. "Winston! His name was Winston! Wow. I wonder if he actually made it." "We'll find out soon enough," Landry said, motioning to the horizon. The control tower for the airport flashed ahead, and he picked up the handset to dial it up.
"Attention, Dalhart Tower, we are coming in for a landing," Landry said.
There was no answer, and he chuckled to himself. "Not sure what I was expecting," he said. "A town this size, I'm sure the airport was on the honor system anyway." He turned his head towards the others.
"Up and at 'em. We're getting ready to land."
The soldiers got themselves ready, or as ready as they could, in the small space, hoping they were still landing in friendly territory. The wheels touched down, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief as Landry shut down the engine. He picked up on it and looked around, blinking.
"What, you didn't have faith in my flying ability?" he asked dryly.
Sparks winced.
I mean,"
she said, stretching out the word. Whitaker leaned forward from the back.
"I think what Sparks is trying to say is that we're pleasantly surprised we're on the ground in one piece," she said. "Yeah, we'll go with that,"
Sparks said, and the girls shared a laugh. They popped open the doors and hopped out, immediately readying their weapons. They weren't sure if the bikers had attacked the town or not, so they wanted to be ready for anything. After several tense moments, they realized they were all alone at the airport.
"I would have thought they would have had a welcoming committee or something,"
Landry said. Whitaker rolled her eyes.
"Dude, this isn't Hawaii," she drawled. "What were you expecting? A hula girl and a lei?"
"Only in my dreams," Landry said wistfully.
"Wait, you think this thing could get to Hawaii?" "You can always give it a try," she said, patting him consolingly on the shoulder. "I'm sure you'll get close enough to swim."
"Knock it off. We have company," Hammond said, and the quartet readied their weapons. They didn't raise them, just kept them at the ready. A truck drove onto the runway and came towards them, honking the horn a few times in excitement.
"They seem friendly,"
Sparks said.
"Let's hope you're right,"
Landry muttered. The vehicle stopped about 20 yards from them and immediately shut off before a man hopped out of the driver's side door, hands already in the air.
"Please, don't shoot," he called. "I'm a friendly."
Everyone looked to Hammond, and he nodded, the four of them relaxing their stances. "Relax, man. We're not going to do anything to you," he said. "I'm Sergeant Hammond. This is Landry, Whitaker, and Sparks." The man perked up and walked straight for the redhead, hand extended for a shake.
"Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Sparks," he said excitedly. "We can't thank you enough for coming up here to help us out."
She was caught off guard by the welcome, allowing the handshake in a daze.
"And who are you exactly?"
she asked as she pulled her hand away.
"Oh, sorry. I'm Ethan,"
he said with a nervous laugh.
"The others are at the courthouse waiting for you."
"Best be taking us there then," Hammond said.
"Oh, yes, sure,"
Ethan said.
"Hop in."
Everybody grabbed their gear from the plane, tossing it into the back of the truck and loading in. Once they were comfortable, the sergeant smacked the side of the truck, and they took off. Landry sat in the passenger seat of the cab, hand on his sidearm discreetly, just in case. The trio in the bed leaned in close, the blowing wind keeping the conversation relatively private.
"You think he's on the up and up?" Hammond asked.
Sparks nodded.
"I think if we were going to be ambushed, they would have done it at the airport," she said. "Way too many cover spots for them, and none for us."
"Whitaker?" the sergeant asked.
She shrugged. "Pretty much what she said," she replied.
He nodded. "Just making sure we're all on the same page," he said. The drive into town was uneventful, with the El Paso crew taking in the sights. The sun was lower in the sky, spreading a beautiful glow across the horizon. The town was so small, reminding them of their fortress in Fabens. A handful of cowboy civilians walked by, looking over in a curious manner, but simply going about their business. Ethan parked in front of the courthouse.
"They're just inside here," he said.
Landry looked around, along the train at the far end of the road, not seeing much in the way of guards.
"Little short on manpower, aren't you?"
he asked as he got out of the truck. Whitaker smacked his chest on the way by.
"Why do you think we're here, dumbass?" she teased.
He shook his head at his own stupidity before joining the group. They found the small conference room in the courthouse, where a motley crew was waiting for them. one looking mangled from a seat in the corner. "Hey, look who I found," Ethan declared. The soldiers followed him in, giving awkward hand waves as they joined the group.
"So, you the hired guns?"
one of the men asked gruffly. "We prefer soldiers of fortune, if I'm being honest," Landry joked. The man didn't seem impressed, simply glaring at him. "Don't mind Ditko," the lone female, likely Jackie, piped up. "He's just salty because I've been reaming him endlessly, seeing as all of this is his fault." The captain seethed.
"I swear,
You're going to do nothing but sit there and thank whatever god you pray to that I haven't started using the term reaming literally," Jackie snarled. Ditko stiffened and flopped back in his chair. Whitaker leaned over to Sparks and whispered loudly, "I like her."
"Well, ma'am,"
Hammond said, taking control of the room. "Jackie," the punk rocker corrected.
"Jackie," the sergeant repeated. "You seem to be the one in charge here. Why don't you walk us through it?"
"I assume you know the basic scenario," she said, leaning against the desk. "But since we last talked, the town has been on high alert. Extra guard patrols, pulling up essential personnel from the farms to get a crash course on combat. All in all, nothing good."
Hammond nodded. "So, what are we going to do about it?" he asked.
"Yeah, we just going to take down a gang leader or what?" Landry added. "Not if we can help it," Jackie said firmly. The soldiers shared confused looks. The silence stretched on, and it was the pilot that raised his hand. "Okay, I'll say it." "What?" he asked. "Are we or are we not here to take out a biker gang?"
"Damn right you are,"
Ditko barked. Jackie shot him a glare, but it was the mayor who stepped forward.
"I think what Jackie is saying is, we're just trying to prevent a war that we can't win,"
he said, ever the diplomat. "And if everybody on the other team is dead, that solves that," Landry said. "Again, Jackie began, but a loud whistle cut her off. The mangled guy in the corner grunted as he sat forward with obvious pain in his face and voice. "The gang you're going up against did this to me," he said. "I'm never going to be the same, and frankly, I'm lucky to be alive at all." Jackie whirled to face him. "And if it wasn't for Axton living up to his end of the bargain, you wouldn't be." He nodded, hissing with the motion. I understand that," he said. "The bottom line, though, is that he's threatening this town. You do what you have to do to stop him from getting that arsenal. If he gets that, we won't survive." Hammond pursed his lips, sharing a glance with his companions. They all had the same look, that they'd walked into something totally different than what they'd imagined.
"Since there doesn't appear to be any consensus on how to proceed, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," the sergeant spoke up. "We're going to secure the gun store, load up everything in it, and bring it back to town. After that, we're taking what's ours and heading out. If these bikers get in our way, they're going to wish they hadn't. If they stay out of our way, we're not going to go looking for trouble."
Ditko opened his mouth, but the sergeant leveled him with a stare that kept him silent.
"That sounds wonderful, sir,"
the mayor said, pressing his palms together.
"We really appreciate your help in dealing with this matter."
"We're ready to head out,"
Hammond interrupted, clearly agitated.
"If someone can show us to our ride."
Jackie nodded, skirting the desk. "Just gotta go grab my go bag and we'll head to the horses," she said. "It's getting late in the day. Maybe you should stay the night in town?" Ethan suggested.
Hammond shook his head. "If these guys are as dangerous as you say, then we need to beat them to the gun store," he said. "We can't do that here in town. Do you have long-range radios?"
"We have some police band ones that will pick up a call from 4 or 5 miles out if you're on the highway," Travis piped up hoarsely. "Best we got."
"They'll have to do," the sergeant said. "Make sure you have someone monitoring them. We might be coming in hot, so having some cover would be nice."
"I'll head it up personally," Travis agreed. "Not like I can do much else." Hammond nodded and turned to Jackie.
"All right, it's your show," he said. "Lead the way."
Chapter 4. It was well into the night, close to 2 in the morning,
by the time the group made it to the safe house at the farm. As soon as they tied up the horses, Hammond turned to the others. "Whitaker, Landry, do a sweep to make sure we're alone up here," he said. "Jackie, Sparks, and I will clear the house."
"No campfire tonight, Sarge?" Landry asked.
Hammond shook his head. "We have 3 hours before we head out again, and I don't want anyone to know we're here," he confirmed.
"I wouldn't worry about it," Jackie said. "We're way north of Dumas and where the gang is."
"Do they know about this place?" the sergeant asked, and she nodded. "Then I want as much cover as we can get. Move." He was cold and calculating, turning towards the house as the soldiers headed off and motioning for the girls to follow. Jackie wrinkled her nose as she walked with him.
"Sorry, I wasn't trying to overrule you there or anything," she said.
"I know," he said sharply. The two of them made it to the house, and he didn't even pause before going inside, doing a quick sweep. The trio quickly cleared each room before coming back from the front entrance, where the soldiers came in.
"We're looking good out there, Sarge," Landry reported. "I didn't see anything either," Whitaker added.
"Whitaker, provisions," Hammond said. "We're bunked in 20. She nodded and dug into her bags for a quick meal for them. She'd barely opened the bag when the sergeant whirled on Jackie, his voice serious and steely. "Now, you and we need to have a chat," he said.
She blinked at him in shock before crossing her arms. "Well, first off, you can drop the hostility," she snapped.
He took a deep breath and relaxed his shoulders a bit. "Fair enough," he agreed with a nod. "But I need some assurances from you."
"Okay," she replied, motioning for him to continue. "What do you need?"
"Back at the courthouse, you didn't seem entirely on board with the whole wiping out the bikers plan," he said. "I need to know why."
She raised her chin. "I'm not a fan of indiscriminate killing, especially when I don't feel like it's justified," she replied easily.
"So, even though they tortured your cowboy friend to the point where he's never going to be the same again," Hammond said slowly, "you want to show them mercy?"
"Axton didn't do that," she explained. "The leader he eliminated, Apollo, did that."
She held up her hand, showing off a missing pinky finger.
"Apollo is also the one who did this to me. Axton put a stop to that."
The sergeant's brow furrowed. "Then where's the beef coming from?" he asked.
"Long story short is that Axton and his friend Levi were in the town prison," she said. "We were out of options, so we busted them out so they could retake control of the gang. In exchange for that, and a peace that could last, Captain Ditko and the mayor struck a deal with him. He keeps his gang away from town and deals with the zombies in Dumas, and Dalhart provides them with a steady supply of food."
Hammond sighed. "Let me guess. Ditko wasn't really on board with that?" he asked.
Jackie shook her head. "Not in the slightest," she said. "He thought we were on a suicide mission, so when we came back victorious, he tried to shoot Levi and one of the other convicts on Axton's side. When they were trying to escape town, some people got injured, and Levi didn't make it."
The sergeant looked at the ceiling, shaking his head and beginning to pace the room. "So now Axton is forced to retaliate or else he loses face with his gang, which not only puts him in danger but also the town," he said. "Yeah, I'm tracking." He gritted his teeth, visibly frustrated, as if it was taking everything he had to flip over a table.
"Guessing this isn't the first time you've been in a situation like this?" Sparks asked.
"No, it is not," Hammond bit out.
"Back in the simpler times of life in the sandbox,"
Landry drawled, sarcastic with the strangeness of that statement.
"We were trying to bring peace to this village in the middle of nowhere. One of the local warlords had been causing trouble for months, so we were brought in. We finally figured out how to incentivize him to stop his raids and attacks on the civilians."
Jackie blinked rapidly.
"How'd you do that?" she asked. "Same way situations have been resolved for generations," Whitaker said as she passed out rations. "With a dump truck full of cash." "And let me guess," Jackie drawled, "there were some people in town who weren't thrilled with that?"
"Nope, not in the slightest," Hammond said as he ripped into his food. "They fought it every step of the way." Sparks cocked her head as she swallowed a mouthful of food.
"So how'd you resolve it?" she asked.
There was a tense silence as the three soldiers shared reluctant glances. "We were pulled out once a couple of our own got caught in the crossfire of a skirmish," Hammond finally said. "Don't know if the brass thought it was an unwinnable situation, or if they were afraid of what we'd do in response to losing a couple of our friends. But the bottom line is that we weren't there anymore."
"I'm sorry for your loss," Jackie said sincerely. "And I'm sorry you've been put in a difficult situation like that again."
"Forgive my callousness," he said slowly. "But all I care about is gathering those weapons and getting out of here with my people still standing."
Her gaze darkened. "That's great and all, Sergeant, but some of us still have to live here once you're gone," she said, voice lethal. "Axton isn't bad. I mean, yeah, he was bad back in normal times, but not torture and kill innocent people bad. And he's not like this today. Please, do what you can to limit the bloodshed. If anybody should bleed, it's Ditko."
Hammond nodded, suddenly looking exhausted. "I know you're right," he said. "I can't make any promises, but we aren't going to slaughter people who don't deserve it."
A smile began to grow on her face, but he waved his hand at her.
"But you need to be prepared to face some unpleasant things," he cut in. "We're going into a battle, and things don't always work out the way we want them to."
She nodded, schooling her expression. "I trust you, Sergeant," she said. "I believe you when you say you don't want to slaughter people who don't deserve it. And believe me when I say that Axton doesn't deserve it. Most of his bikers don't deserve it."
Hammond nodded before shaking the ration in his hand. "Okay, with that out of the way, let's eat and bunk down," he commanded. "Tomorrow's going to be here soon."
Chapter 5. Day 0 plus 48. The group had been riding for an hour, the sun coming up from beneath the horizon. The sky was particularly brilliant that morning, so much so that Hammond couldn't help but stop to admire it. Numerous layers of clouds were bathed in deep red hues, contrasted by black shadows on the various ridges of the puffy clouds. It was the kind of scene that looked like a Bob Ross painting of a demonic hellscape. "Look at the brilliant crimson sky," Landry said in an overly dramatized voice. "'Tis a signal from the gods that they are on our side. Today we will vanquish our enemies and bathe in their blood." Jackie blinked at him, eyebrows raised. "Is this guy serious?" she asked. "I'm just fucking with you," Landry replied, dissolving into laughter. "But wouldn't it be cool if it were true?" She scoffed and shook her head, prompting more laughter. But when he looked around at everyone else just staring at him, he stopped. "What?" he asked sheepishly. "I thought it sounded cool."
"Jackie, how close are we to town?" Hammond asked.
"Cactus is just up ahead," Jackie replied. "From there, we head south for a couple of miles. The gun store is there."
The sergeant nodded and got back to riding. They made it to Cactus, finding the remnants of previous battles, as well as some straggler zombies roaming about. They navigated the road and cars, making it to the other side and finding a dirt bike trailer that led south, giving them a clear path but staying off of the highway. They rode swiftly, knowing they didn't have much time to waste. As they approached Dumas, they were stunned when a massive explosion went off in the distance. The horses startled, hopping about. Hammond stopped immediately.
"What in the hell was that?"
Landry demanded. A plume of smoke wafted up in the distance, and Hammond shook his head. "Nothing good," he growled. "Come on." He pointed to a hill just to their left, tall enough for them to see into downtown Dumas. They rode towards it, but he diverted course away from it and the town.
"What are you doing?"
Landry asked. The sergeant shook his head. "Saw movement on the top of the hill," he said.
"Then why aren't they shooting at us?"
Landry hissed. "Don't know," the sergeant replied. "Maybe they're looking towards town." He hopped off of his horse, motioning for Whittaker to join him. "You three, stay with the horses." Jackie stared at him with pleading eyes, and he replied with a reassuring nod, letting her know that he wasn't going to just kill them outright. He hoped he didn't have to anyway.
He led Whittaker towards the back of the hill, which was a pretty steep climb, going up a good 50 or 60 yards. When they got closer, they spotted 2 men at the top of it, their focus towards downtown. Hammond gave Whittaker a nod, and they moved up, off to the side of one another, each covering a target as they quickly and quietly moved up the dirt hill. Within 15 yards, one of the bikers turned around to grab something out of a cooler. He spotted them coming up the hill and reached for his gun, but Hammond shook his head. The biker froze midair, and his buddy grunted. "Hey, man, what's taking so long? Where's my beer?" he asked. But before he could turn around, Whittaker's gun pressed against the base of his neck. "Sorry, beer time is going to have to wait," she said. "Son of a bitch," the biker whined. "Just make it quick, will you? I've seen people die slow from gunshots, and I don't want to have that experience." "Relax. We're not going to kill you," Hammond said, "unless you give us a reason to." He pushed his prisoner back a little, and Whittaker did the same. The 2 men turned around, hands in the air, staring in confusion at the 2 soldiers. "Well, if you ain't gonna kill us, then what do you want?" the first one asked. "What's going on down there?" Hammond asked. "We're fighting zombies, just like you, right?" came the shaky reply. "You could give us a hand if you want," the other one added. There was another explosion about a mile away, sending another huge plume of smoke into the air. Hammond looked at the trajectory of the explosions, realizing it was a quarter mile away from the first one, leading out of town. "Getting a caravan of them, huh?" the sergeant asked. "Don't suppose you're running those things up to Dalhart, are you?" The bikers exchanged a frightened look, but neither of them seemed to want to be the one to answer. "Relax, fellas. We're not going to tell Axton," Whittaker said. They blinked at her in confusion, as if they were flabbergasted these 2 strangers knew their boss. "We're smarter than we look," she said, and glanced around before shaking her head. "Damn, I was going to burn Landry." Light gunfire peppered the downtown area before a voice came over the radio. "All right, we got a diversion going on 6th, a voice came through. "They falling for it?" Hammond motioned to Whittaker to grab the binoculars and take a look. "Where's 6th?" she asked. "About halfway up the downtown area," one of the bikers replied. "They're pulling to your right." She nodded, picking up the specs and looking through them. After several moments, she found the highway and 6th. Hundreds of zombies shambled in the road, a small fraction of them moving away from the highway, taking the bait. "Come on now, stop sucking each other off and tell me if it's working," the voice through the radio urged. Hammond looked down at the walkie-talkie, and in the split second his eyes left them, one of the prisoners attempted to grab Whittaker. As soon as his hand touched her shoulder, she smashed her elbow into the bridge of his nose, shattering it. She grabbed his shirt, headbutting him hard in his already broken face, before shoving him to the side and kicking his knee, dislocating it. He yelped, hitting the ground in a heap. His nose coated his face with blood as he clutched his knee. Whittaker stared down his friend. "You want to try something too?" she asked. The biker kept his hands high, shaking his head profusely. Nope, I'm good," he stammered. "So, where's the gun store?" Hammond asked. The non-wounded biker looked at his buddy writhing around in pain, clear that he was next if he didn't fess up. "Fuck it," he muttered. "You already know everything, anyway." He inclined his head towards Whittaker. "Grab those glasses and find 6th. She raised the binoculars to her eyes and scanned, finding the right street. "Got it," she said. "Go up about 4 blocks and look to your left," he instructed. Whittaker scanned. "What am I looking for?" she asked. "You see a lone car in a parking lot?" the biker asked. "Single-story building with bars on the windows." She nodded. "Got it," she said. "There you go," he replied, hope in his tone that he was going to live through this. "How's it looking?" Hammond asked. She studied the area for several moments before responding. "Crowded," she finally said, surveying the 80 or so zombies around the building and in the parking lot. Most were focused on the building itself, but some were just wandering around aimlessly. "So, what are you doing with us?" the biker asked, voice with an edge of hoarseness. The sergeant looked around, seeing that they had a bag nearby with a couple of pairs of handcuffs as decoration. "You got a key for those?" he asked, inclining his head. The biker nodded, slowly moving his hand down towards his pocket. He raised an eyebrow in question, and Hammond nodded to give him permission to reach in. He pulled out his bike keys, tossing them over towards Whitaker. "Okay, you boys get on the ground, and each of you grab an ankle that isn't yours," the sergeant instructed. The two men sat up, grabbing each other's ankles. Whitaker grabbed the cuffs, attaching one wrist to the other's ankle, and doing the same to the other. Hammond held up the keys, jingling them. "These will be on your bike," he said. "You're going to leave us like this?" the biker demanded. "Yeah, what if those things come up here?" the other one asked, voice shrill. "It's a steep grade. You should be able to knock them over and send them rolling back down," the sergeant replied with a wave of his hand. "Besides, we'll tell your boss you're up here," Whitaker promised. Another explosion went off in the distance, further up the road than the previous one. Hammond shook his head, then said, "We're going to have to deal with that sooner rather than later." Chapter 6. The others stood by the horses as Hammond and Whitaker came running back down to them, moving much faster than they normally would if everything was okay. As they rushed over, another explosion went off in the distance. "What's going on, Sarge?" Landry asked. "Nothing good," Hammond replied. "They're already pushing towards the gun store." The private raised his rifle, readying it. "Let's go get 'em then," he said. Hammond shook his head. "We got a bigger problem," he replied. "The explosions?" Sparks asked. He nodded. "Yeah, they're pulling zombies away from town," he explained. Landry shrugged. "So it makes it easier for us to get to the gun store," he said. "What's the problem?" "The problem is that they're headed in the direction of Dalhart," Jackie interjected. "So if that mob from Amarillo didn't dislodge the ones in downtown—" She trailed off with a shudder. "Then they would have just joined them," Sparks finished. Whitaker raised a hand. "Take it from us, dealing with a mob on a highway is no joke," she said. "Which is why we need to stop them from luring that mob up to Dalhart," Hammond added. Landry shrugged again. "They got the trains blockading everything. They'll be fine," he said. Jackie shook her head. "The trains don't go all the way down, and they know that," she explained. "All they have to do is pull them off the highway. Then it's a mile through the fields to get to town. They'll be overrun." Landry scrubbed a hand down his face and gaped at Jackie. "And this is the guy you're defending?" he asked. She wanted to respond, but she didn't know what to think. She shook her head, trying hard to find some kind of explanation or excuse. "Maybe it's a power play?" she asked. But she knew it was as weak as it sounded. "Pulling 1,000 zombies into town surely qualifies as a power play," Landry drawled. She shook her head. "No, this," she stammered, taking a deep breath. "This is his way of splitting the baby." Hammond's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, it's the best solution to a complex problem," Jackie explained, her voice rising as she gained confidence in her line of thinking. "If he doesn't show strength, then his gang revolts, and that's bad for everyone. If he comes in guns a-blazing, then the town is wiped out. But Axton knows what Dalhart's defenses are." She raised her eyes to the sergeant, eyes hopeful. "They're elevated, well protected, and most of the civilian population is miles away working on the farms. So he pulls zombies up there, floods the town with them, and puts the fear of God into Ditko and the mayor. Then with the arsenal, he comes in, cleans it up, but only after he's secured a better deal for his gang." The soldiers exchanged some glances, looking skeptical. "That's pretty flimsy," Whitaker said. Hammond shrugged. "But plausible," he admitted. "Still, we need to put a stop to it. We're not going through all this trouble only to burn through the ammo taking out a man-made zombie infestation." Jackie glared at him. He sighed. "And yes, it'll save some lives too," he added. She smirked and nodded approvingly. "So, what's the plan?" Landry asked impatiently.
Whitaker and I will take care of the gun store, Hammond declared.
We will?
She asked, shock all over her face as she blinked at him. He cocked his head. What, you not up to it? He teased.
Oh, I am. Just curious as to how you envision us pulling that off, she drawled.
The sergeant held up the radio they'd taken from the bikers on the hill.
As long as I can sound like a gruff biker, we have some unwitting allies, he said.
I'll be polite and not point out the glaring hole in your plan there, Hammond, Whitaker said dryly.
That's appreciated, he quipped, and turned to the others. Landry, I want you to take Sparks and Jackie and stop that zombie parade. Divert them. Stop them. I don't care. Just make sure they don't get to town.
3 people on horseback. This shouldn't be a problem at all, Landry said, rubbing his forehead.
Sparks pointed to the bag on one of the horses that contained Rufus's explosive goodies.
I guarantee ours are a lot louder than theirs, she said.
I believe it, Landry admitted.
Hammond, you want any?
Sparks asked. He shook his head. No, we need to be as stealthy as we can, he said. Plus, the last thing we want is to set a homing beacon for zombies and bikers alike. Sparks nodded, hauling herself up onto one of the horses as Landry and Jackie followed suit. If everything goes to shit, we regroup back at the farm, Hammond instructed. It's a haul, but I don't know another safe spot between here and home. We're going to be too far out for comms to work. So, if you hit the fallback position and the sun comes up, head back to town. Landry nodded.
You two be safe, he said.
Whitaker winked at him playfully.
He's got his deadliest soldier beside him, she said. We'll be fine. Come on, I'm pretty sure there's a farm about 1.5 miles up the highway there, Jackie said, gripping her reins. We should be able to beat them to it.
Lead the way, Landry agreed, nodding. They raced off, leaving the 2 soldiers to themselves. They turned, gazing over the downtown area, a smattering of gunfire peppering the air as throngs of zombies moved all over the place. You ready? Hammond asked. Whitaker cracked her knuckles.
Let's do it, she said.
The 2 shared a fist bump and took off towards the outskirts of town, ready to do battle. Chapter 7. Whitaker and Hammond rushed through the leading edges of downtown, taking cover behind a small gas station building on the corner, just before where the battle was taking place. They were right on the highway that cut through the center of town, making sure not to expose themselves to the ghouls on the highway. They looked across the street, where there were 2 standalone buildings on the block. A dozen or so zombies stood in front of the building on their left, and 2 bikers fought with a couple of creatures on the right.
How many blocks are we from the gun store?
Whitaker asked. Hammond peered out. About 4 blocks, he said. They watched the 2 bikers fighting with machetes, slicing the creatures that were close to them. The bikers were easily taking down the ghouls, while the ones in front of the other store and a few from the highway came their way. They watched while listening on the radio as one of them called for help.
We need some distraction, now!
The biker cried. A few seconds later, several shots popped off from the other side of the highway, pulling some of the ghouls in their direction.
What's the play?
Whitaker asked quietly. Hammond looked across the street, spotting some zombies starting to come through the gap between the 2 buildings. We need to get into the store and get to the other side, he said. That'll give us time to regroup and figure out what kind of mess we're dealing with on the other side.
And the bikers?
She asked. He took a deep breath, thinking about it long and hard before finding his answer. We try to get them inside with us, he said. Not that I am wholly invested in keeping them all alive, but I know that I don't want runners out there.
Okay,
Whitaker agreed.
On your mark.
He lowered his knees, ready to spring, and waited until a batch of 3 ghouls made it within striking distance of the bikers, before they broke from cover. The soldiers ran hard, keeping pace with one another, as they rushed towards the bikers and the zombies. One of them took down his ghoul, looking up and locking eyes with the soldiers rushing his way.
He shoved the corpse away and reached for his radio to give his buddies a warning. He didn't make it, however, before Whittaker arrived. She lowered her shoulder, driving it into his gut and lifting him off of his feet, shoving him back through the front glass window. The biker was big enough and flew with enough force that he dislodged the window pane from its moorings, sending them both crashing inside the small office. Hammond reached his biker, who was confused and entangled with two creatures. The commotion caused him to lose focus for a brief second, which allowed for one of the zombies to grab onto his arm. He panicked, flailing around and trying to break free. Hammond came up behind the zombies, stabbing one in the head and freeing up the biker. This allowed him to take care of the other one. By the time he turned back to the sergeant, he was greeted by a handgun aimed at his face. "Either get in the building or die now, your call," Hammond said. The biker hesitated for a brief second before quickly filing in, picking up his stunned buddy. "What the hell are you doing?" one of them hissed as the other grabbed his radio. "Drop the radio and your weapons. Do it now," Hammond cried. The bikers stood their ground for a moment, betting on him not being willing to fire. "Yeah, that's what I thought," the one with the radio said. "Whittaker," Hammond said, and she grabbed a paperweight from one of the desks and chucked it, hitting the biker square in the face and knocking him to the ground. "This is coming your way next if you don't do what he says," she warned, flicking her knife through her fingers expertly. The moans coming from behind them were concerning, and Whittaker looked over her shoulder at the ghouls crowding around where the window had been. It was a couple feet up to get inside, which gave them a little protection, but not much. Hammond cocked the hammer back on his gun. "Last chance, boys," he warned. The bikers exchanged a glance before complying, dropping their weapons and radio on the desk next to them. "Now, get in that back office and lock it up," the sergeant instructed. Their brows furrowed, not sure what to make of his instructions. "Move! Now!" he barked. The bikers didn't question it, rather taking off, running to the back and barricading themselves in an office. As they did, a zombie managed to crawl in through the window, immediately met by Whittaker, forcefully kicking it and sending it right back outside. "You know, we're not going to be able to save everybody, right?" she huffed. "Yeah, I know, but at least they'll know we tried," he replied. "Might come in handy." Whittaker kicked another ghoul back out the window as Hammond moved to the other side of the building, looking out towards the next block. There were about 30 or so zombies between them and the next structure, many of them still hovering about, waiting for something to draw their attention. Whittaker kicked another ghoul out before turning and yelling back to Hammond. There was a growing number of ghouls by the window, which allowed for several of them to attempt to get in at the same time. "What are we doing, Sarge?" she demanded. "Running out of time over here." He contemplated for a brief moment before raising the radio to his lips, trying to sound as gruff as he could. "Need another diversion, now," he said. "Johnny, is that you?" someone replied. "I said now!" Hammond yelled back, hoping the panicked tone would spur action. There wasn't a response, just a flurry of gunfire from across the highway. The sergeant watched as several of the zombies moved away from the building. "Buy us 30 seconds, and we're on the move," he called back over his shoulder. "Copy that," Whittaker replied, kicking a couple more zombies off of the window as they tried to climb in before rushing to the other side. She crouched behind Hammond, looking out and watching a quarter of the zombies move out towards the highway, with more headed that way. "Where's our entry point?" she asked. He pointed to a glass door in the middle of the building. "If it's unlocked, we go in and lock it up," he instructed. "And if it's locked?" she asked. "Crack the top out with your rifle," he said. She nodded and glanced back at the window, where creatures were falling ass over tea kettle into the office. "Let's move," Hammond said, and threw open a side door to lead her out. Before he could even take a step out, gunfire erupted, bullets narrowly missing his head and hitting the doorframe. "Hammond!" Whittaker cried, grabbing the back of his shirt and jerking him back inside as more shots rang out. The soldiers readied their weapons, the sergeant with a handgun and Whittaker with a rifle, getting into position to return fire. Whitaker made it to the window beside the door, looking out and spotting several gunmen across the highway on the roof. "Got two, possibly more shooters on the roof, and they got a lead on us," she said. Hammond looked back at the zombies staggering halfway across the office, giving them mere moments before they would need to get out of there. "Well, we can't stay here," he said. "Call it out, Sarge," Whitaker said. "Give me 5 seconds of suppressing fire, then move your ass," Hammond instructed. "Copy," she replied. "On your mark." "Go," Hammond cried, and Whitaker opened fire, shooting through the window towards the gunmen she could see. While she wasn't coming close to hitting them, she was close enough to force them back behind cover. As she fired, the sergeant raced out of the building, running as hard as he could across the street towards the other building. His footsteps drew the attention of several zombies, who turned around and reached out for him, but he was too quick. Whitaker counted to 5 and stopped shooting, standing up and turning towards the ghouls in the building with her. She aimed and fired a couple of times, hitting the closest couple before she moved over to the door. Hammond continued to run, evading zombies as he went. He made it to the glass door, firing his handgun several times at the top panel. The glass splintered, being safety stuff, but it weakened enough for him to kick it out once he made it there. He quickly opened the door, getting inside and doing a quick sweep of the immediate vicinity, finding it empty. He turned and aimed his handgun back towards the rooftops, but the gunmen were out of his sight line. "Damn it," he muttered. He hoped for the best, firing wildly in their direction. This gave Whitaker a brief window to sprint out from the door, but almost immediately the gunfire started up, the impacts all around her feet. She knew she was a sitting duck and wouldn't make it across the street, so she ran towards the mob that had turned around towards her. She made it a few zombies deep, staying low as the bullets continued to fly in her direction. The ghouls reached out, trying to grab her, but she was too quick. The creatures provided enough cover for the gunman to lose sight of her, opening fire wildly. A torrent of bullets ripped through the rotted flesh all around her, sending splatters and body parts flying about. She managed to avoid both the bullets and the zombies long enough to get to the side of the building. Hammond waved her in, taking aim at zombies that might cut off her path to the doorway, and picking them off one by one as she ran. She managed to get to the doorway before any of the ghouls could get to her, and they locked it up tight. "You good?" Hammond asked. She patted herself down, amazed that she'd managed to make it out without a bite or a bullet. "Yeah," she breathed, "but I don't want to do that again anytime soon." "Come on, we gotta move," the sergeant said. They turned in towards the building, finding that they were in the entryway to a larger warehouse. There was a door leading to the main floor of the single-story building, and it was filled with rows of boxes and crates. The two soldiers readied their weapons, preparing to breach. Hammond nodded as Whitaker threw open the door, allowing him to go in first. He moved to the right, with Whitaker following and aiming to the left. They could hear footsteps coming from within the building, moving too quickly for zombies. They immediately went into combat mode, with Hammond giving the throat-slash gesture, letting her know that they were done playing nice. She gave him a nod, slinging her rifle over her shoulder and drawing her handgun and knife, dual-wielding and ready to do damage. They moved towards the wall buttressed up against the highway, which had some skylights that lit up the area. When they were a couple of rows away, a shot rang out, causing them to split up, one on each side of the aisle. "They're on this side!" someone yelled. "Divide and conquer?" Hammond asked. Whitaker nodded. "See you on the other side," she agreed. The sergeant took a knee, looking down the aisle and aiming his handgun, trying his best to stay in the shadows as he did so. While he did that, Whitaker moved back the way they came, pausing at the next aisle and looking down, hearing the squeaks of the biker boots rushing towards them. She turned the corner, staying flush against the boxes, deep in shadow as she moved, ready to strike. When she made it halfway down, she noticed that there was a gap that created an aisle through the middle of the rows. A couple of footsteps came up from the other side, so she darted across out of the way. Whitaker lay in wait, listening to the rapidly approaching footsteps, noting that there were 2 sets of them. When they got close enough, she struck, swinging her knife outwards and catching a large biker in the shoulder with it, dropping him to the ground in a heap of pain. She aimed her handgun towards the other one, who managed to fling his arm towards hers, knocking it out of the way before she could fire and out of her hand. Whitaker lunged forward, throwing an elbow at her opponent, who was about her height but more muscular, catching him in the chest and knocking him back. The 2 of them reset and got ready to fight. "This should be fun," he said with a sneer. She smirked right back at him. "Funny, I was thinking the same thing," she said. The biker made the first move, coming towards her and swinging a haymaker, which she ducked under. They retaliated with a couple of kidney punches, sending him staggering backwards. He let out a grunt before rushing forward, trying to bear hug her. Whitaker darted out of the way, using his momentum to shove him by like a matador, taking care of an angry bull. She tried to attack from behind, but the biker did a swinging back fist, which she had to block. There was enough force behind it to knock her off balance, and she had to catch herself on the boxes. As they readied for the next volley of attacks, gunfire erupted behind them, with it coming from both sides.
"You ain't getting out of here alive,"
the biker growled. She bared her teeth. "I'll take that bet," she quipped, and rushed forward, leaping up and swinging her arm down, catching him off guard. He blocked the swing, grabbing her arm and flipping her over. She landed hard on the ground, knocking some wind from her lungs. She looked up just as he was about to stomp her face in, and she managed to roll out of the way just in time. As the boot hit hard on the ground, Whitaker tried to pull herself up, only to feel her ankle being grabbed by the wounded biker on the ground. The standing biker saw this opportunity, rushing forward in a mad haymaker, but she ducked under it, following up with a stomp on the knife in her opponent's shoulder. The wounded man howled in pain as it was driven straight through him, the tip hitting the concrete flooring. She broke free from his grip, readying herself for the biker's next attack. She didn't have to wait long. The biker didn't give her a chance to fully catch her breath, rushing forward with another bear hug attempt. This time, Whitaker went low, ducking down and wrapping her arms around his back leg and yanking as hard as she could. The force pulled him completely off of his feet, causing him to land face first on his wounded friend on the ground. Whitaker didn't hesitate, immediately jumping on his back, driving her knee into his spine and pinning him. She reached down and ripped the knife free of the wounded man's shoulder, taking a fistful of the top man's hair and slitting his throat clean open, blood pouring out as his body went limp. The wounded one beneath was enraged, trying to get up, but before he could shove his dying friend off of him, Whitaker jammed the knife into his chest a couple of times. Though painful, she missed the heart, and the biker was stunned, in a ton of pain and bleeding profusely. He was still on the attack, though, flailing his arms, so she stabbed him a few more times, putting an end to his agonizing final moments. As she knelt there, hurt and breathing heavily, the gunfire from the neighboring aisle intensified. She looked over and found one of the bikers rushing up to the gap, sliding and putting himself against the wall for cover. He was completely focused on Hammond, trying to get the perfect shot, so she moved quickly but quietly up behind him, knife at the ready. She waited for him to finish firing before grabbing him by his rat-tail pony and yanking him back, stabbing the blade into his throat. His mouth opened and closed, and he sputtered blood, his last moments looking so confused as to how he was suddenly dying. She pulled him away from the aisle, hoping that none of his buddies had seen what had happened to him. She picked up his handgun, aiming it towards the aisle, waiting to see if anybody was coming to investigate. After several moments, and some more shots from both sides, she was convinced they weren't coming. Whitaker retreated, going back and grabbing her own gun before moving quickly down the aisle, listening for the gunfire coming from the other side. There were small gaps between the boxes, so she could see through in some instances. As the gunfire grew louder, she found where they were at, and peeked through several openings before finding a target. There was a biker kneeling down behind a box that he'd pulled from the shelf for cover, and she lined up her shot, firing and putting a round easily into the side of his head. Immediately following the kill shot, she was forced to hit the ground, as several panic shots came from 2 positions on the other side. Shouts echoed, but the noise was too much to be able to comprehend what they were saying. She crawled away from the bullets while keeping the guns in her hands, and a second later, a box fell down into her aisle, making her turn and unload in that general direction with both guns. She managed to hit a charging biker several times in various parts of his body, dropping him to the ground in a heap. He hit the ground hard, trying desperately to raise his gun up to fire a shot. She quickly aimed and put him down. As Whitaker got back to her feet, several shots came closer, moving down the aisle like they were coming from Hammond. He fired 6 rounds before going quiet.
"Clear," the sergeant barked. "Whitaker, you good?"
"I'm clear," she replied, slow to get up as he came through the opening that the attacking biker had come through. He spotted her and came to help her up. "Thanks for the assist," he said. She grimaced and hissed as she got to her feet. "Shit, you sure you're okay?" he asked, brow furrowing in concern. She nodded. "Yeah, had a bit of a disagreement with those 2, she said, motioning towards the heap of bleeding bikers, now sprawled in a veritable lake of crimson.
"Glad to see you were able to convince them," Hammond quipped.
"Wasn't easy," she admitted.
"Come on, we can't stay here," the sergeant urged, and the 2 of them rushed to the next side entrance.
There were no windows, and as soon as they opened the metal door, they were greeted with gunfire, forced to shut it quickly. "Damn it," Hammond hissed. "They're really onto us," Whitaker huffed. He glanced at her. "I am open to ideas," he said. "No windows on this side, so we don't even know what we're walking into," she murmured.
"Run and gun?"
Hammond suggested, but she held up a finger to signal to him to hold on. Whitaker waved him away from the door, before laying on the ground and taking out her knife. She jammed it into the weather stripping on the bottom of the door, peeling off a small portion. Across the street were 3 buildings that were connected. The one against the highway to the right had glass around the front side, with a couple of bikers firing from the doorway. The middle building was solid brick with only a door, and the one on the left had a glass front, with bikers in the doorway of that one as well. 2 bikers stood on the roof of the middle building, aiming rifles at the steel door. There were also a few dozen zombies in the road, with more coming from the highway, drawn to the noise. "How's it looking?" Hammond asked quietly. "We're not getting across that way," she replied. 3 buildings, 2 shooters in the highway building, 2 on the roof in the middle, and 2 more to the building on the left. We don't have the firepower or the manpower to hold them down long enough to get across.
Plus, it doesn't sound like we have much in the way of a place to go," Hammond added.
Whitaker nodded. "Road's filling up with those things, too," she said. He helped her up, and they continued their plotting, and a look began to form on the sergeant's face. A look like he was cooking something up in his brain. "I don't like that look, Hammond," Whitaker warned. "Nothing good ever comes from it."
He grinned. "On the bright side, if I pull it off, you'll have another story to complain about," he said.
She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "What are you thinking?" she asked, defeated.
"We go across the street," he said.
Whitaker blinked at him in shock. "Across the highway?" she demanded. "The highway that is tightly packed with zombies?"
"Yep. They'll never see it coming," Hammond declared.
"Yeah, no shit. Why would they?" she drawled, sarcasm evident in her tone. "It's a suicide run."
He shook his head. "Let's at least take a look before you dismiss it," he urged.
Whitaker nodded, following the sergeant over to the door that led to the highway. She repeated her weather-stripping trick and got down on the floor to take a look.
"What do you see?" Hammond asked.
"Wall-to-wall zombies," she said dryly.
"Past that?" he asked.
Looks like a fast food restaurant, she replied. The sergeant nodded slowly. I can work with that, he said. How tightly packed are the zombies? If we get up ahead of steam, we should be able to push through as long as we stay on our feet, Whitaker said slowly, contemplating the idea. We get tripped up, then we're down for the count. Good, Hammond said. Good? She snapped. He nodded as he helped her to her feet. Yep, they're not going to expect us to go this way, he said. We push through them, get to the fast food restaurant, circle around it, and immediately launch an assault on the next block. She stared at him blankly, shaking her head in awe. Really? She asked. He shrugged. It's not the worst idea I've ever had, he argued. Top 3, she counted. He smirked. Top 5, he said. Top 5 with potential, she said firmly, pointing a finger at him. He tilted his head back and forth, finally nodding. Yeah, I can buy that, he finally agreed. The duo got their rifles and gear stored, everything except for their handguns. This door gets opened, and you stay on my ass and don't stop moving, Hammond said firmly, all seriousness now. If I go down, you go over and get to that gun store. She nodded. And if I go down, you keep moving, she said. He nodded, putting his hand on the door handle. He counted down from 3, and on 0, flung open the door to reveal a sea of zombies. The combination of the door opening and the pounding footsteps of the 2 sprinting soldiers caused the nearby ghouls to turn their attention towards them. Hammond moved quickly, lowering his shoulder and barreling through the first few zombies, creating a little bit of space for him and Whitaker to run through. By the time they got to the road, just a few yards away from the door, they were completely surrounded by snarling corpses. The sergeant continued his push, plowing through ghouls like he was a fullback leading his running back through the defense. The moans all around them were excited and hungry, gnarling hands reaching out for them as they moved. There was a little bit of an opening in the road, a couple of yards void in the middle. Hit him to the back, Hammond barked. Whitaker followed his lead, darting to the opposite side as him and grabbing a zombie, throwing it to the ground behind them. This caused a pile-up to their rear, giving them just a tiny bit of breathing room. The soldiers fell back in line, and Hammond tried to pick up speed again, but he was met with a bit of a wall of zombies. Creatures grasped at them, mere feet away from their goal. Whitaker slammed into Hammond from behind, shoving him forward through the mass. The sergeant grabbed onto the zombie directly in front of him, lifting it off of its feet and using it to drive them back. This was just enough to knock several down and clear a path for them to get out of the road and to the parking lot of the fast food restaurant. There were a couple dozen ghouls in the parking lot, as most of them were in the road, but they were spread out pretty well. Hammond and Whitaker broke formation, each of them darting around the ghouls and throwing them to the ground as they went, so they tripped up the followers. Any moment they expected a shot to ring out towards them, but it never came. The duo made it to the side of the restaurant, peeking around the back and seeing a small fenced-in area where the playground was. They hopped it and took cover to catch their breath. That sucked, Whitaker gasped. Only halfway there, Hammond huffed. We gotta get moving. You want to bypass this block and just come at the gun store from across the highway? She suggested. He shook his head. No, we need to take these guys down, he replied. Or at least just the ones on the roof. She nodded. Start at the closest shop and work our way down? She asked. That's the plan, he said, just as a pack of zombies came around the corner of the restaurant, moaning and shambling towards the gate. Guess that's our cue, Whitaker said, rolling her shoulders and getting ready for the next leg of their journey. Keep your head down and watch for gunfire, Hammond said. She nodded. See you on the other side, Sarge, she said. He led them out, hopping over the fence and to the edge of the building. They looked across the street, finding the zombies were spread out a little more in the road, a lot of them attracted to the buildings due to gunfire. While there wasn't a clear path to the front store, it was a lot clearer path than they'd had to get to the restaurant. Hammond studied the situation for a moment, finding that the roof shooters were intently focused on the door of the building. A second later, the radio flared up, turned low so as not to alert zombies, but loud enough for Hammond to pick it up and put it to his ear.
"We need eyes on the building 2 blocks north of the gun store," somebody was saying. "Anybody inside copy?"
There was a long silence. Then the same voice again said,
"Diversion team, get over there. Come in through the north side. We have the south exit covered. If you see the troublemakers, put 'em down."
"Copy that," someone else said. "That's good. They think we're still in there," Hammond said. Whitaker gave him a pat on the back as a good job, but also to let him know that she was ready to roll. He led them out, running hard towards the first batch of zombies. The sergeant wove in and out of outstretched hands, avoiding being grabbed, with his partner right on his 6. They reached the road, shoving their way through zombies, although it was a lot easier this time with the way they were spread out. They mostly pushed through the mob, shoving some away and creating more space for themselves. As they made it halfway across the highway, gunfire erupted from the front of the building. Hammond flinched until he looked up and saw the bikers inside were shooting through the crack in the door at the zombies trying to get inside. Hammond looked up, finding a massive zombie near the front glass, easily 300 pounds, pressed up against the glass and trying to get in.
"We're gonna ram that big bastard,"
Hammond said. Whitaker smacked him on the back again as confirmation, and they continued their race towards the big building. As they got closer, he raised his weapon, firing it a couple of times towards the heavy-set zombie, hitting the glass right around him.
"Now!"
Hammond barked. Whitaker came around him, and they both picked up a head of steam, hitting the large monster at the same time. Their combined force, aided by his immense weight, sent them all crashing through the glass and into the small clothing store. Both of them rolled off of the big zombie, who was agitated, to say the least. Hammond spun around, drawing his knife and driving it into the base of its skull, ending the threat. Whitaker, meanwhile, got to her feet and moved through the store, taking cover beneath the racks of clothes, moving towards the front of the store. One of the bikers broke away from the door, pulling out his radio to call it in, when Whitaker came out of nowhere, grabbing him by the wrist and snapping his arm at the elbow. As the walkie-talkie hit the floor, she delivered a forceful strike to his throat, causing him to gag. His buddy by the door turned to fire, which she spotted out of the corner of her eye, and she dove back into the racks, the bullets hitting his biker friend in the arm and spinning him to the ground in a ton of pain. The door biker was forced to go back to shooting out the door as the zombies continued to press on. Whitaker got up, ready to deal with that, when Hammond let out a whistle from behind her. She looked back, seeing him motion to follow, so she obeyed. He led her to the back of the store, through the back room. The biker struggled to deal with the door, but she left him to do so, his attention not on them. When they made it into the back, they quickly secured the door behind them, Hammond picking up a bar off of the ground and slamming it into the locking mechanism, sealing them inside. There were skylights above, providing light for the dimly lit storeroom. Numerous boxes stood in stacks along the walls and into the corners, but the center of the room was wide open. At the far end was another door that was locked up tight, and doors on either side leading to the street. "Where are we?" Whitaker asked. "Looks like that second building," Hammond explained. "Guess it's some sort of shared storeroom." "Double-check that door. I'll check the front," she said. The sergeant got to it as Whitaker moved to the front door, which faced the gun store. There were no windows, just a single metal door. Whitaker listened closely outside for noise. She could hear moaning and commotion, but nothing overly close. She looked over to Hammond, who was walking back towards her. "We're secure," he said. "How's it look here?" "Doesn't sound like anything is right outside," Whitaker replied. "But something is going on." He readied his handgun, giving her the nod to crack the door. As it inched open, they peeked outside at the battle. 3 bikers stood across the street in front of the gun store. Two of them fought against a small mob of zombies that was slowly shambling their way, while the other was working on picking the lock to the front door. The two bikers were using melee weapons, a machete and a baseball bat, to crack skulls and fight off the creatures as they approached. They were relatively close to the building, which provided them some cover from the road. They were out of sight of the mob that was still attracted to the occasional gun burst coming from the other side. However, several had broken back towards the trio due to the gunfire inside the building. "How do you want to play it?" Whitaker whispered. Hammond thought for a moment, looking at them fighting and working. There were about a dozen zombies near them within 10 yards, and another dozen spread out over 20 yards, stretching back to the highway. Hammond looked over and saw the Connors' car, and he nodded. "We're waiting for them to get the door open for us," he said quietly. "Then we're going to use our inside man." Whitaker's brow furrowed. "Inside man?" she asked. He pointed to the car, and she was still confused, shaking her head and shrugging. "That's the gun shop owner's car," Hammond explained. "So if it's still there, then so are they. There's a good chance they're inside, and since they aren't shooting at the bikers—" "They're fresh," Whitaker finished, finally catching on. "Probably not runners, but definitely faster than those shamblers," he continued. "As soon as that door opens, he's going to be in for a surprise, and that's when we go." She pointed up. "What about them?" she asked. "We just have to hope they're still focused on the other side," the sergeant said. "Or that they're shitty shots." "Or both," Whitaker muttered. He chuckled. "Oh, come on. When have we ever been that lucky?" he asked. "Well, we did have that takedown a couple years back where the target was a collector of fine whiskey," she pointed out. He rolled his eyes. "Okay, name 2 times we've ever been that lucky," he said. "Fair enough," she conceded. They shared a soft chuckle and readied their weapons, watching intently as the bikers continued to fight and work on the door. Finally, the gun shop door cracked open towards the door. The lock-picking biker began to turn around to let his buddies know, but before he could get a single word out, the door crashed open, knocking him to the ground. He let out a scream as the 2 zombies, an older woman and teenage boy, fell down on top of their meal. Before his friends could even turn around, they already had their teeth in him. "Now!" Hammond hissed, and the soldiers burst out onto the street, sprinting as hard as they could, while the bikers were distracted. They got halfway across before either of the fighters turned to notice something other than zombies rushing towards them. They didn't have guns, just their melee weapons, which they raised up as Hammond and Whitaker got close. The sergeant grabbed a nearby zombie, and when he was within 5 yards of his machete-wielding opponent, shoved the ghoul towards him. The biker panic-swung, clearly not expecting the corpse to be moving that quickly. The blade caught the creature in the shoulder, forceful enough to knock it to the side. The distraction gave Hammond a chance to get up close to the biker, delivering a punch to the bridge of his nose, knocking him back and stunning him. Whitaker, meanwhile, just pulled and aimed her handgun at the baseball bat-wielding biker, firing a shot towards his legs. The bullet grazed his thigh, but it was enough to send him diving out of her way. The 2 soldiers darted around the feasting zombies, getting inside and quickly pulling the door shut behind them. Hammond secured it, locking it up tight. "Clear the building," he barked. "At least 1 more in here." "On it," Whitaker said, drawing her knife with her offhand, keeping her gun up high. The skylights at the top of the wall illuminated the gun store enough for her to see, just not all that well. She moved along the front wall, looking down each aisle for signs of trouble, finding nothing. When she made it to the end, she doubled back, making it past Hammond, who was keeping tabs on the door, making sure the bikers didn't make another attempt. When she got to the end of the path, she found nothing. "Clear in the aisles. Headed to the back," she called. The front door began to thump and bang, and Hammond tensed. "I'll watch this," he called back. "Just be ready to move if I need you," she warned. He motioned to the store, full shelves everywhere.
Well, we have plenty of ammo, so don't worry about burning some, he said. Whittaker nodded and worked her way towards the back. As she got close to the counter, she could hear movement coming from the back office. She slowly moved up, looking behind the counter to make sure it was clear. As she approached the office door, there was a loud smack against it, startling her. The ghoul inside, likely Mr. Connor, was badly eaten up. He was missing significant chunks of his face and neck, and likely a lot more that was covered up by the bottom part of the door. She wasn't sure exactly what had happened, but it was pretty evident that the trip from the car into the store hadn't gone as planned. Whittaker drew her handgun, aiming at the creature through the window of the office door, firing a single round that ripped through his head. The man fell back, landing with a thud on the ground. Whittaker peeked her head into the office, seeing nothing but blood covering the desk and walls, like something bad had gone down in there. With him out of the way, she turned towards the storeroom, walking slowly towards it, gun at the ready. She saw that the door swung both ways, so she planted her foot by it, so that it would only open a few inches. She banged on it hard, listening closely, but hearing nothing. Just to be sure, she poked her head through, finding a small room filled with boxes. None were more than chest high, and she could see the entire room from the door. There was nothing standing. She did a quick check just to be sure, finding it empty. She checked the loading dock door, a big metal number that was chained up tightly. As she walked back to the front, the banging on the door had gone silent, causing Hammond to lower his gun. "We're clear," Whittaker said. The sergeant tilted his head towards her. "How are we looking in the back?" he asked. "Small room, few boxes," she said. "Loading dock door is locked up tight." "We should still set up defenses," Hammond said. "It looks like that's the only other breach point." He pointed up at the skylights that had bars on them. "They're not getting through those." She blinked a few times. "You think they're coming in here?" she asked. Before Hammond could answer, there was a barrage of gunfire outside which hit the door and shattered the windows. The duo instinctively hit the ground, but they quickly realized that the bullets weren't getting through the thick concrete walls, only the windows. "Well, that didn't accomplish much," Whittaker quipped. A loud bullhorn blared outside.
"Hello! Testing, testing,"
somebody said into the speaker.
1, 2.
Hammond pointed to the broken window. "Made it easier for us to hear him prattle on," he said. Whittaker nodded in agreement as the person continued speaking.
"Well, not sure who you are, but just in case nobody has done this yet, welcome to Dumas, Texas,"
the man drawled, and they were quite sure this was Axton.
"Or if I had to guess, welcome to the Panhandle of Texas, because you two, you don't seem like you're from around here."
"Oh yeah?" Hammond yelled from the floor. "What gave you that idea?"
"I spent enough time in Dalhart to know that nobody that's left up there is crazy enough to run straight into the heart of a zombie-infested town,"
the man said with a chuckle.
"I'm pretty confident in saying none of them could have done what you did to my boys."
"Just so you know, we tried our best not to kill him," Hammond yelled. "We left your boys on the hill tied up, and a couple more locked up." Axton paused for a moment, as if he were contemplating that bit of information.
"I must say, that's a bit of unexpected news," he said. "Given what I saw in the warehouse, I took you for a scorched earth kind of guy."
"Only when I need to be," Hammond called.
"You still got that radio you took off one of my boys?"
he asked. "Yep," the sergeant yelled.
"Channel 6,
came the reply. Hammond glanced at Whittaker and shrugged as he pulled out the radio, tuning it to the correct channel. "Hello?" he asked, thankful to be done yelling.
"There you are,"
Axton said.
"Figured that despite our differences, we could at least be civilized."
The sergeant took a breath. "And you must be Axton," he said.
"That I am," came the confirmation. "But you have me at a bit of a disadvantage here, good sir. You mind sharing who you and your friend are?"
Couldn't hurt, the soldier quipped. I'm Sergeant Hammond, and my right-hand woman here is Private Whitaker.
Now what in the world is the military doing up in these parts?
Axton asked, sounding surprised.
I heard a rumor that you were busy up in the northwest.
Hammond nodded. Yeah, we heard that too, he said. We're not exactly rolling with that crowd anymore.
Went AWOL, huh?
Axton asked. We wanted to fight, the sergeant said. Our CO had orders to run.
I can respect that,
Axton admitted.
But you didn't answer my question, Sergeant. What are you doing in my neck of the woods?
Hammond took a deep breath. Without boring you to death with the details, the good people of Dalhart said we could take as much guns and ammo as we could carry from this shop, as long as we prevent you from getting it.
Is that a fact?
The biker leader asked. It is indeed, the sergeant confirmed.
Now, what if I offered you the same deal?
Axton countered.
With a bonus offer of giving you a second pickup at some point in the future.
Hammond tilted his head back and forth. Tempting as that is, I'm afraid we're kind of committed to our original deal, seeing as how we're parked at the Dalhart airport, he replied. And if you're doing what we think you're doing, then we're on a tight timeline to get back.
So, you figured that out, huh?
Axton drawled. Not the first time we've seen a diversion tactic, Hammond said.
Well, just so you know, that wasn't exactly my idea,
the biker leader said. The sergeant rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Don't be modest, he drawled. We know you're in control of this gang.
Oh, I very much am,
Axton confirmed.
But I also had a few people I was incarcerated with who weren't about the gang lifestyle.
So you set them free to lead a mob of zombies to a civilian population, Hammond said dryly.
Don't be so dramatic, Axton huffed. You and I both know that there's virtually nobody in town anymore. And you have my word that none of those things are coming within a country mile of any of the farms.
The sergeant pursed his lips. And your convict buddies? He asked.
Them either,
Axton promised. Hammond took a moment, then said, As strange as it sounds, I actually believe you.
I'm a truthful man, Sergeant. Ask anybody,
came the reply. We did, and while most of the people weren't exactly fond of you, there was one who stuck up for you, Hammond said.
I assume you're speaking of Jackie,
Axton asked. The very same, the sergeant said.
It warms my heart to know that she wasn't harmed during the fallout from when Captain Ditko broke our deal,
the biker leader said, and he sounded sincere, almost wistful. She's tough, Hammond said, in more ways than one. Not sure what you did to deserve it, but she stuck up for you pretty well.
It is good to know I haven't lost my touch,
Axton quipped. Hammond sighed. Well, as much fun as it is chatting with you, it would appear as though we find ourselves in a bit of a situation, he said.
That, Sergeant, would be an understatement,
Axton agreed. You seem to have a good handle on things, Hammond said. I'm open to suggestions on how to resolve it.
I'm afraid I already made you my best offer,
Axton replied, and even sounded as if he were regretful about it.
However, if you want to kind of stick to your original deal, I can let you load up whatever you can carry into Mr. Connor's car and drive off into the sunset. Pretty sure you can beat the mob back to Dalhart and catch your flight.
Hammond glanced at Whitaker, his eyebrows raised, but she raised her palms, shaking her head. Don't look at me, she said. I feel like we walked into the middle of a domestic disturbance. I don't know who's right or wrong, but I'm willing to bet that while he might let us go, his men aren't after what we did to their friends. That's a valid point, Hammond said, and turned back to the radio. Say there, we're still a little out of breath and trying to gather ourselves. Don't suppose you could let us chew on that offer for a bit, could you? Axton chuckled, low in his throat.
Well, Sergeant, as fate would have it, I need to move around a few men and attend to a few things, he said. What do you say we pick this up in a few minutes or so?
I appreciate that, Hammond replied, and then injected his voice with as much fake concern as he could. Oh, and you be careful out there. Lots of those things about.
Just another day at the office, Sergeant,
Axton drawled.
Just another day at the office.
The line went dead, and Hammond tossed the radio onto a nearby shelf with more than a little bit of frustration. What do you think he's planning? Whitaker asked. I can't imagine it's anything good for us, the sergeant quipped. Question is, what are we planning? Whitaker looked around at the impressive display of weaponry. There were shotguns, rifles, sniper rifles, assault rifles, and nearly an entire wall of handguns, with the ammo to go along with them. It is tempting to just load up what we can and go, she admitted. And leave a biker gang with an arsenal and vendetta against a small town? The sergeant asked, cocking a brow. She cocked her head, knowing somebody was going to have to say it. A vendetta that might be justified, she said. Still, I don't feel great about it, Hammond said. Whitaker sighed. So we're staying then? She asked. He nodded. Hold it for as long as we can, and hope Landry and the others can stop the mob, he said. Then what? Whitaker asked. He paused, and then his shoulders slumped. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe chase off Axton and his gang. Load up what we can, and torch the rest. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. You want to torch an arsenal? She gasped. Especially given what's going on back home? It's not my first choice, he assured her, raising his hands. But if we can get what we want and disarm both sides up here, maybe cooler heads prevail. She pointed a firm finger at him. Torching is a last resort, she demanded. He saluted her playfully. Yes, ma'am, he said. Well, if we're staying, then I'm going to start shoring up our defenses in the back, she said with a sigh, getting to her feet. And getting us some go-backs packed?
Oh, Sergeant, Axton crackled through the radio. Are you there?
Hammond nodded to Whitaker. I'll handle him, then join you, he said, and then raised the walkie to his lips as she headed off. I'm here, he said into the radio.
I'm afraid our break time is over, Axton said. Gonna need an answer. You coming out willingly and taking what you can carry, or you going for option B?
Hammond paused for effect. My daddy always used to tell me that taking the more difficult path can be more rewarding than the easy one, he said slowly. So, going to go with option B.
I have to say, Sergeant, I am disappointed in you, Axton said.
Funny, my ex-wife said the exact same thing, Hammond quipped. Axton chuckled.
I just want you to know what's about to happen isn't personal, he said, and the sergeant imagined the man standing with his hand over his heart.
Likewise, Hammond said.
Will you do me one favor, though?
Axton asked. The sergeant paused, then shrugged. Suppose so, he said.
If you come out of this, and I don't, give my apologies to Jackie, Axton said. I never wanted this, and I want her to know that.
I'm pretty sure she knows, Hammond assured him, but I will reiterate that when I see her. Axton laughed.
You are a cocky one, aren't you? He asked.
Just confident in my abilities, Hammond replied.
Those abilities are about to be put to the test, Axton promised.
Good luck, Sergeant. You're going to need it. The line went dead, and Hammond tossed the walkie-talkie back onto the shelf. He stood there for a beat, thinking to himself for a moment about how he and his men had ended up in this situation. He finally shook his head, summing up the day with a single word. Fuck. The end.